Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. I'm just going to leave us on this slide for a moment. And I just want to say welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for sharing your Friday with us again, if you joined us last Friday. We have a lot of content, so we're going to get started very shortly. What I'm doing now is letting people stream into the room. I want you to go ahead and take a moment to get familiar with your webinar software. There will be a little box that pops up somewhere that will have all kinds of options for you in there. And let's go ahead and get going. We have a jam-packed schedule today. We have 90 minutes together, and we are very... Hi, is that you, Cindy?
Yeah, I finally got on. I don't know how.
That's fabulous. Okay, we are just getting started. So Cindy, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, and we are getting started. So we have 90 minutes together, everybody, and we are so excited to be doing this with you today. This is our third year together doing webinars as a task force. And this webinar is webinar number 11. We're going to be talking today about sexual wellness as a form of sexual violence primary prevention, specifically talking about people with cognitive disabilities. We're going to divide our webinar into 5 sections today. We're going to talk about housekeeping and introductions. We're going to be talking about a little bit of grounding, what we mean by sexual violence primary prevention and disability justice. And then we're going to have a great conversation with 6 panelists about the very subject. And then I think that we'll take questions during the whole time, but we do have a section at the end for questions. So this webinar today is being recorded. I want to tell you a little bit about the technology. If you're having audio issues, go to your audio box and try to call in rather than streaming on the internet. We have more audience members than we typically do. And so what that does is I think it's slowing things down. There are frequently asked questions in your handout box. That's in a PDF. You can also get the slides as a PDF and some other kinds of handouts in your handout section. If you're interested in seeing the live stream captioning, please open the URL that is on your screen. I will go ahead and drop that in the chat box as soon as I can so that you can just click on that and open it. You will have to open a new browser window to do that and keep it open sort of over or beside your webinar window. And I do want to mention that today we are using our webcams, and if that is something that becomes overwhelming to you, you do have the option to turn them off. I think you can determine for yourself who you see in the webcam, whether you want to just see the speaker or you want to see everybody. So you can also slide it up so you can hide the video. Sorry, if you could hide people's webcams if it's irritating to you. And so finally, we want you to ask questions. So put in any kind of chats or questions in your chat question area in your dashboard. And so then Skye and I, mostly me today because Skye's a panelist, will answer those for you. And so today I'm your host. I just want you to know that I have been learning about primary prevention since 2005. I have worked with the task force for going on 3 years now, and I do identify as a person with disabilities, and I'm going to pass the mic to my coworker, Skye.
Hi, everybody. I actually wanted to first say that this is actually webinar 12. I think you accidentally said it was 11, but it's a great problem to have that we've done so many that we're losing track. I have also been doing violence prevention or intervention since about 2008. Since 2013, I've been the program coordinator for the multicultural efforts to end sexual assault. I also have an art adventure called Fairy Bear Art, and I serve as a board member for Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed. I'm a trans person who is autistic and has other disabilities. And I have a photo up of myself smelling flowers from a couple of years ago whenever I had longer hair.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Ciccarelli. I work for Indiana University School of Medicine. I'm an internal medicine and pediatric doctor. I'm the director of the Center of Youth and Adults with Conditions of Childhood. We call that KAYAK. And we're involved with providing transition support for youth and young adults who have disabilities as they move from childhood into adult healthcare. And because of that, I've become significantly involved in sexual health as an important component of that transition in life.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jordan. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a consultant with the Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence, a member of the Abuse Prevention Disability Task Force, also an advanced emergency medical technician, and I'm a disability advocate.
Sorry about that. I didn't know I was muted. But good afternoon, everyone. My name is Timotheus Gordon. I use he, his, or him pronouns. I'm a research assistant at the Institute for the Institute on Disability and Human Development at UIC. I am also one of the co-founders for the Chicagoland Disabled People of Color Coalition, or Chicagoland DPOC, where we spread disability pride, acceptance, and inclusion in marginalized communities throughout the Chicagoland area.
Cierra, could you unmute Cindy?
Cindy, I unmuted you, but I think you need to unmute yourself on your side. It's like a little red microphone with a line through it that you might have to press until it's green.
Cierra, why don't I go while Cindy's figuring it out?
Okay.
So my name is Pam Malin. I work at Disability Rights Wisconsin. I am the advocacy specialist for the Victim of Crime Act. We work with victims of crime with disabilities. And I'm also the VAWA project coordinator for the Safe and Healthy Relationships curriculum that we are writing through a VAWA grant. And I've sat on the Wisconsin Board for People with Developmental Disabilities for the last 10 years.
Thanks, Cindy. Thanks, Pam. Sorry, Pam. Cindy, have you found a way to unmute? I wonder, Pam, if
let me give her a call.
Okay. Okay. So we will go to the next slide. We will come back to Cindy's bio as soon as we can. So I just wanted to let you know who's here. So we have a lot of anti-violence coalitions and programs, so state coalitions and local programs. We have disability advocates, we have disability services, we have educators and medical providers, doctors, military, public health people, and students. And this is really great. So one of the things that we need to do before we head into this material is let you know that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Indiana State Department of Health have supported us through the Rape Prevention and Education Grant, but they don't necessarily endorse what we do. And I'm going to turn it over for a quick note on language.
Yes, so we wanted to make sure and give a brief definition of intellectual or cognitive and developmental disabilities. I want to make a note that we designed this definition ourselves because we actually looked at several other places like the National Institutes for Health, and the definitions they had for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities were really disparaging. So we created our own. So the definition we're working with today is that these are disabilities that are usually present at birth and often result in differences in cognitive, physical, and/or emotional development. Some people with cognitive and developmental disabilities refer to themselves as neurodivergent as opposed to those who are neurotypical. And then the last note I wanted to make on language is that I think most people say the phrase intellectual and developmental disability. In other words, often you might see it shortened to IDD. Personally, as a person with a cognitive developmental disability, I strongly prefer the phrase cognitive and developmental disabilities because I think very often the concept of intellectuality or intelligence is rooted in very ableist ideas about what makes someone quote unquote smart or dumb. And I would like to live in a world where we understand that the concept of intelligence is really flawed and that everybody has different kinds of intelligence. I think it's more accurate to say cognitive and developmental disabilities, but I realize that everyone has their own preferences, and this is a topic that's in debate in disability communities. And so we're going to probably switch between, say, intellectual and developmental disabilities and cognitive and developmental disabilities, just to recognize that people do have different preferences. And that's why we're switching between them, but we're basically using them interchangeably.
Oops, thanks, Skye. So just right now, we're going to spend a little bit of time doing some grounding, getting on the same page with each other about what public health is, about what we mean about sexual wellness and disability justice. So part of establishing this common ground together is figuring out mean when we're talking about sexual wellness. And so what we just basically want to say is that this includes knowledge about your body, bodily functions, consent, healthy relationships, and access to sexual health services. And I really enjoy that in this World Health Organization definition, they mention pleasure and safety. I think those two things can go hand in hand. They should and often do. So today we're focusing on sexual wellness for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities because they are typically left out or have the least amount of access to info about their bodies and about sexual health and sexuality. And so we wanted to ask what our panelists think. So let's just go through and we'll popcorn. What's one thing that you think contributes to sexual wellness for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities? And why don't we go ahead and start with you, Dr. Ciccarelli?
Hard for me to limit it to one thing, but I'll try. I think that recognizing that all humans have sensuality is the first piece I think of, that we all have a sense of ourselves and we all have a need for touch of various sorts.
How about you, Jordan? Oh, go ahead.
Is that me? Okay, I think the biggest thing, in my opinion, is that just self-education, because so often we exclude people that have disabilities from sexual education programs. We assume that they're never going to be sexual, etc. And so they don't have the understanding, or they don't have good education about their own bodies and what they would like to do with them.
Thanks, Jordan. What about you, Timotheus?
You're still muted, I'm sorry.
Keep
Timotheus, you
reminding
need
myself
to-
to unmute when I speak.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. I think the one thing for me when knowing about sexual wellness for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities is having the access to learn not only that sexual wellness involves intercourse, but also other intimate acts as well, and knowing when to say no or how to say no to those acts if it's unwanted, or also initiating how to access intimacy in a appropriate manner.
Thanks. Pam or Cindy?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. I figured this out. Good. So,
This is you, Cindy? Yes? Is this Cindy speaking?
yes, this is
Okay,
Cindy.
perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
Go for it.
The question for parents, what is one of the things that you think considered to sexual wellness for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities? Did you understand that?
Do you want to tell us something that you think about that?
Yes. Education about their bodies, and so they can understand about their bodies.
Thank you so much, Cindy.
You're welcome.
Pam?
I would concur with pretty much what's been said, but I think information is power. And really, in the work that I do with around sexual violence, power and control is a thing that certainly comes into play. And I think the more information you have about what is healthy sexuality and healthy wellness, sexual wellness, the more information you have about what's unhealthy or abusive. So I think information is power.
And thank you so much, Pam. I see, Skye, I want to hear from you, and Dr. Ciccarelli, I see you wanted to add to that. So let's go Skye and then Dr. Ciccarelli.
One thing that I think about a lot is people with disabilities knowing that their disability does not make them less desirable as a friend or as a partner. I think very often, especially for folks who have complex medical needs from a young age, you get used to people touching you regardless of your desire for that. And especially as for young people, many times people with disabilities may not have a lot of, or may not feel that they have, or may really not have a lot of choice about their physical interactions with other folks. And so kind of, learning that you should be allowed to determine if and when you are touched, and knowing what kinds of touch that you actually enjoy.
Mary?
I think we said a list of a lot of good things. We maybe didn't talk, the one more I wanted to add in is the interplay in persons with cognitive and developmental disabilities between them and various caregivers plays a significant role in both access and education opportunities for this population. And so the training isn't as simple as training the person. It's about helping the caregivers check their own attitudes and then think about what training they need to perhaps expand those attitudes to a more respectful and advocacy role for the person that they help with in caregiving. And that impacts their access to healthcare, their access to health education, as well as opportunities to express themselves, and perhaps also be, I think we didn't explicitly mention individuals in this population who have identity and orientation issues that their caregivers do or don't disagree with. And then because of the caregiver-person relationship, that can often play another dynamic.
Right. I love this, and I don't want to cut us off. I would like for you to participate, Timotheus, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Go for it.
Dr. Cierra, I'd also like to add, not only in recognizing of disagreements with the spectrum of sexuality, but also I think people with disabilities in general, especially cognitive and developmental disabilities, should learn that there are wide ranges of sexualities. There is no such thing as a quote unquote right sexuality. It's really up to that person how to express themselves, whether it's through the LGBT plus spectrum or monogamous or polyamorous. It's bigger than, the spectrum is bigger than we think.
Absolutely. I think the one thing that we can take away from this just little brief definition of sexual wellness is that it is complicated, it is often in flux, and it is throughout the entire lifetime. And the reason why we are talking about sexual wellness is because it is such an integral part of people's lives. It's part of our lives that we often do not get to talk about or address one's sexual wellness. It's still taboo. And so one of the things that we want to do is try to figure out what's the baseline for sexual health in Indiana? What's the baseline for sexual health in your community? And how do we measure that? And how do we know what's going on? And one of the ways that you can do that is using the public health approach to try to drill down. I don't really like that metaphor. Try to figure out the shape of the context. And so what we have done together is we had to tweak some typical tools to gather data about the risks and protections in Indiana communities for people with cognitive disabilities. We also, so we did a literature review, we created and piloted a community strengths and needs assessment. And so I just want to go through that just really quickly. Last webinar number 11, we talked in depth about this literature review. And so I'm just going to very quickly remind you where you can get it and remind you what risk factors that we saw. But one of the things that I want to tell you before I move into the specific risk factors that we found is that we typically best practice for sexual violence primary prevention is to focus on addressing perpetration and reducing risks for perpetration. And that is best practice. We don't, yes. So, okay. So why we found though, in the research that researchers were doing research on victimization, and they were reporting on victimization largely. And so we actually did not find any research that addresses or correlates sexual violence perpetration and people with cognitive disabilities. And rather than not show what we found, we just want to highlight really quickly that the societal level risk factors for victimization for people with cognitive disabilities include lack of education, negative attitudes, others lack of belief when a person reports, false ideas about sexuality, social isolation, and lack of accountability. Now, these community risk factors also might be considered societal level risk factors because they are very structural. Haley Rigger, statewide rape crisis coordinator, has spent a lot of time last webinar on this. And so I highly recommend that you check that out. The community level risk factors are experiencing poverty, no internet, lack of opportunity, no public transportation, and lack of accessible transportation. And finally, the organizational risk factors are lack of resources, staff turnover, lack of experience, and lack of confidence, specifically addressing sexual wellness, insufficient background checks for everybody, overly restrictive environments, and no procedural clarity. So now I'm going to turn it over to Skye to talk about the community strengths and needs assessment that we piloted.
Yeah, so what we did was thank you for switching it. I'm sorry. I live next to kind of a busy intersection, even though I live in a kind of rural area. So I apologize. I will try to stop speaking if there are mopeds that come by a lot. Okay, so our pilot assessment included responses from 26 people who are people with disabilities. We covered 9 out of the 92 counties, and I was amazed that the responses were very evenly distributed. So we had responses really from all over the state. Most of our responses were women, but we also had men, non-binary folks, and a few people who didn't want to respond. Most of our responses were white, but given that Indiana is, I believe, close to 90% white, we did have a higher response rate of people of color than is statistically residing in Indiana. We are going to hope to have additional focus on making sure that we are getting responses from a wide range of genders and races as we continue to expand this project. I was also really excited that we really received responses from people with a wide range of disabilities. So that included people with genetic or pathogenic chronic illnesses, cognitive and developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, neurodivergence or mental illness. Quite a few folks, so over 50%, said that they had multiple disabilities, and a fourth of the respondents indicated they had disabilities that were not listed, and some folks decided that they did not want to disclose what kinds of disabilities that they have. So I want to give a very brief summary of some of the information we received. And I want to first just remind folks that we only had 26 respondents. So we are not saying that this is representative of all people with disabilities or even people with disabilities in Indiana, but it did give us a really interesting view into the disparities that people are experiencing around sexual harm and or access to sexual wellness. So less than 50% of respondents indicated that they consistently received accurate information about their body, how to take care of their body, or how to practice safer sex. Barely half the survey respondents felt consistently empowered to report harm, and almost 3/4 of respondents felt that adults, while they were minors, that adults had not encouraged them to explore their body, sexual desires, or boundaries, or they were just unsure if they had ever received any kind of encouragement. Similarly, over 3/4 of respondents felt that adults had never helped them practice communicating their boundaries or desires generally, so that's not just sexually, but generally, or they were not sure if adults had ever helped them with that. And then the last thing I want to highlight is that we found that over 61% of respondents felt that adults had not helped them practice respecting others' desires and boundaries, or were unsure if they had ever had those kinds of conversations or practices. And that, I think, is also really important because we know that statistically that there is a significant number of people with cognitive or developmental disabilities who might be accused or even criminally charged of some type of sexual harassment or sexual harm. But we know that disproportionately when those things happen, it's because the person was not aware of how to have good boundaries. They may not have even intended or known that they were causing harm. And so truly having access to knowing what your boundaries are and what other people's boundaries are is a really important protective factor against people being accused of or really causing sexual or other kinds of interpersonal harm. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, one survey question I wanted to highlight was we asked people whenever they were minors, what else could parents, caregivers, educators, service providers, or other adults have done to help you learn about safer sex and healthy sexuality? And the responses we got were not surprising, but they were still startling. One person said, literally anything. The only time I was taught about anything about sex was a single class when I was 10. Another person said, they talk to me would have helped instead of giving me a pamphlet to read. Another person responded, provide medically accurate information about my body, provide safer sex information without stigma about sex or bodies, especially LGBTQ plus inclusive safer sex education. And another response that was not the only person who responded like this said, I don't know. And I thought it was important that we include that response because frequently people with cognitive and developmental disabilities have such low access to this kind of education and information that they may not even know what they don't know to even ask or to try to get this kind of knowledge or skill base. One last thing was in another question, we asked people about their experiences reporting harm, and one person responded, I never felt comfortable to report service providers who were hurting them. I often felt like my disabilities make people find anything I say to be irrelevant. And I wanted to highlight that because I think that that's a really common experience for people with disabilities who are working with service providers or caregivers, that often because of their disability, they might feel like nobody is even willing to listen to them. Okay, so that was a very brief introduction to the community strengths and needs assessment we did. We will gradually be publishing more information about that and research we're doing, but we wanted most of this webinar to be dedicated to a conversation among the panelists that we have here today. And before we begin, I wanted to remind all the panelists that everyone is welcome to respond to any questions that they would like. You're also welcome to pass and not respond to questions. And I want to encourage us, since we have quite a few of us here today, to be courteous about the amount of time we're taking to respond so that every panelist has the opportunity to respond in the ways that they would like. And the last quick note is I wanted to actually ask Pam if you would turn your video off since it's not working. That way the folks who do have videos, our videos can be enlarged. Thank you. Okay, so we have a series of 6 questions we've predetermined to ask the panelists. And I'm going to be serving as the moderator today, but I will also sometimes respond as a panelist. Because Cierra is so kindly taking care of questions and being the host and dealing with technical issues. And after or even during these questions, if folks have other questions, you're welcome to put questions in the question box and Cierra will bring them up to us. Or we can also respond to questions unrelated to these questions at the end of the webinar today. So the first question that we're going to start with is, what are key similarities and differences between delivering sex education for neurotypical youth versus youth with a cognitive or developmental disability? Does somebody want to begin their response to this?
Sure can. I think one similarity I could think of is in both instances, it is important to give accurate information on people's bodies, spectrum of sexuality, and also the many acts that could be done, and also how to access consent, or also how to get resources if you are harmed the differences, maybe with neurotypical youth, you might not have to explain much. They assume that, it should be self-explanatory, but for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities, you may need visual cues. You may need to put things in plain language so that they could understand, or even put it into relatable stories that is more relatable than what's being put out there in the curriculum now.
Thank you. Does anybody else, Mary, want to respond?
I think about sexual education for everyone. I think about the domains of sexual behaviors and what happens in puberty, and infections and contraception, and what pregnancy is, as well as what healthcare exams you need. And all of that might be a long list, I know, of parts of what sexual education ought to be. And as we think about all of those things, there are slight variations and nuances to how different people learn. And while I like the term neurodivergent very much, I also like the term that we all have differences in our learning. And whatever our way we learn, that's the way we have to be taught. And so if I'm a person with very significant limitations in my ability to learn in a traditional classroom format, then we have to change what that looks like for that person. And so there's not an answer as it's not this way for everybody with IDD and this way for everybody who's neurotypical, right? It's much broader than that. And when I think in general about IDD, I think about making things simpler so they're more clear, but still not nuanced. What do I want to say? Using the right terms for different body parts. A lot of people choose to teach persons who have cognitive or developmental disabilities not the anatomical terms, and then it makes that person's communication with others limited to that other person then understanding. So if a patient comes into me as a doctor and uses a term that doesn't clearly mean to me one of their parts of their genitals, I might not understand what they're telling me because their communications are so different. And then practice is really important in this population. So a single learning, our core curriculum in Indiana teaches health ed once, and that's supposed to be good enough for everybody. It's not, but it's certainly less good for individuals who benefit from practice and repetition.
Thank you. Jordan, I think you raised your hand earlier.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of similarities. I also think, as Dr. Mary mentioned, correct terminology is incredibly important. I can think of some times where that has been, in my own experience. I remember a situation where somebody said that their uncle was putting his hand in her purse. Well, purse was the term that she was using for her vagina, and nobody recognized that. And so I think it's, using the correct terms and teaching those correct terms and when to use those terms is incredibly important. I also think it's important to remember that just as we have some neuro differences, we may also have physical differences, and how those people with physical differences access sexuality may be a little bit different. What is appropriate to ask a personal care attendant to do? For example, if you need help, getting set up to masturbate, is that something that you can ask your home health provider to do? And it should be, but how to do that, how to ask that, and also for the providers, how to handle those requests, because that's not going to be a request that everybody's going to be expecting or comfortable handling at first. But it is, part of somebody's autonomy, and something that they should have access to. And so I think that's really important to talk about, you know, body autonomy and what you have the right to do and not do, and how to expect others to react to those things.
Timotheus, did you want to respond to this question?
Jordan, I like the idea of ensuring that when describing any thing sexual, especially with body parts, that we use the terms that are more familiar or terms that we should be referring to. But or also I also like to add another nuance of, you know, what if you're a person with any type of disability and you live in a place in Indiana where you may not hear certain terms. You might hear more vernacular terms to describe your body. Then the question that I would like to pose in general, a more rhetorical question, is how can we have a balance between using medical terms or using family-friendly terms to describe sex or body parts in general, or maybe even had to switch to a particular vernacular to describe it, depending on the community. So that's really my nuance.
I'm just going to jump in here real quick, and I just wanted to say that I think that Timotheus, that really leads us into this next question about risks. And so why don't we talk about question 2?
Can I actually go back to question 1 and just add one thing that I think is important? Cierra, thank you.
Of course you can. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add that other folks haven't touched on yet is the importance of acknowledging people's religious background and how that might impact their understanding of sexuality and sex education. Speaking as a panelist, like I was raised in a really fundamentalist Christian community in Texas, and I was taught things like Jesus is always watching you. And as somebody who took things very literally, I even remember having conversations with other friends who were in my faith community, and they would tell me things like, you know, yes, of course, Jesus is with you even when you're in the restroom. And that sounds kind of funny to me as an adult now, but like as a young autistic person, like trying to understand my body in a place where my body period was just highly stigmatized. And I was taught that bodies were basically the embodiment of sin. So I was raised with a very negative understanding of what my body even was. So trying to understand what I often took very literal religious teachings really impacted my ability to understand my own sexuality and my body. And so, you know, often, of course, we have like a separation of church and state, but I don't think that it is helpful to ignore questions that young people may have about their religious background. I realize that's a really tricky thing to respond to, but making sure that you're open to just having conversations about faith and sexuality, I think is really important, especially like we know that we have a really high percentage of people in Indiana who come from Orthodox or more traditional or conservative backgrounds. So making sure that you're meeting people where they're at and recognizing that disproportionately people with cognitive and developmental disabilities may be taking those teachings very literally, and that may impact how they understand how to engage with themselves sexually. Okay, yeah, that was the thing that I wanted to add.
I wanted to give a chance for Cindy and Pam to jump in.
Yeah, Cindy was actually the first person who responded.
Oh, okay. Maybe I am reading an old message from Pam.
No, Cindy wasn't.
No, I was not.
Oh, sorry.
So Pam, you wanna, and then
Go
I'll
ahead,
answer the
Go ahead,
question of,
Cindy.
Pam, do you wanna ask the question first and then
Do you want me to ask you again?
yeah.
Okay. So it says, what are the key similarities and differences between delivering sex education for neurotypical youth versus youth with a cognitive or developmental disability? Go ahead, Cindy.
So so I gotta make sure I'm on slide 26, right?
You're on 33.
Oh, I'm on 33.
Yep.
Oh, because she's got this, okay, 33. I'm sorry, we tried to get this together
It's
yesterday.
okay. So Cindy, you
Okay,
take a look for it. And
I got it,
okay.
I got
All right.
it, I got it. I'm
Sorry,
sorry,
guys.
okay, so the question is, and
Yeah.
they just, okay, here I go. They just need to do it, teach people with disabilities. Take more time, make it easier and simply, and repeat it over and over. So me and Pam, what I talked about with Pam last night when we were getting this together is they need to start when they're in 5th grade all the way until they're in high school. So they repeat this in every grade they're in until they're out of high school. So they start in middle school and all the way up, just so you know.
Thanks, Cindy. The only thing I wanted to add
Oh
was that
yeah, sorry.
oftentimes we hear people putting in their own biases when they're teaching, especially individuals with disabilities, um, cognitive or developmental. So I think that that's important that we make sure the people that are teaching are comfortable with the topic and that they're going to be honest and forthright. I think the other piece that I've seen quite often is that individuals will put it in a good touch, bad touch terminology, which is really not okay, especially with individuals who think differently or process differently or are neurotypical, because when you have the bad touch, yet it might have felt good, yet it might still have been abuse, and we're putting it in those terminologies, people don't often report, or maybe they, people have different needs or tolerances or even sexual likes that they have. And so that may be confusing within that as well. So I think the biggest piece is we need people who are willing to take the time and not bring their biases and really be honest and open.
Thank you both so much. I'm sorry that I got mixed up with the previous question. I thought you already spoke. Okay, can we go to, thank you. Can we go to the next question, please? Okay, so this question is, how might we better prepare persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities to address their increased exposure to risk for sexual and other violence? And before I open this up to the panel, I wanted to mention that I think this is an incredibly important question, and we really struggled with how to phrase this because we are not saying that people with disabilities or anybody who is victimized is responsible for preventing their own victimization. We're trying to acknowledge that very often there are certain aspects of having a cognitive or developmental disability that people take advantage of and put people at greater risk for harm. And we really want to think about what are things that we have done to learn how to try to support our own safety. Okay, so does anybody want to begin?
Can you just repeat the question, what you just said, so I'm on the right thing here?
Yes, we're on slide 34, and the question is, how might we better prepare persons with intellectual...
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Do you want to go ahead and respond?
I guess, yes, okay. Pam, you want to do the question and I do the other part? We're going to do it tag team with this.
The question was already asked, Cindy, so if you just want to go ahead with your answers, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So my answer is adults need to be talking about it adults need to be talking about this to them. Start young, before puberty and every year after. They need to teach about their body. It says teach, or need to teach, yeah, about their body, break it down and simply to help them understand. Most of all, stop being quiet about it. So I know it's growing up, and when I was in high school, they didn't talk to us about our bodies, so much. So we need to not be quiet about it. And Pam can, be in that. I think, got to talk when they get into puberty. You got to start when they're in their puberty or before they're in their puberty. And now Pam can say what she wants to say.
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, the biggest thing that Cindy and I discussed last night when we were talking about it is that it just needs to be something that we talk about it, and that we're not hiding it or being secretive or just pretending like it's not an issue until it is an issue, which I think really has put us where we're at right now with a lot of the increased numbers. It's because we don't talk about it until they're victims of abuse or in a situation that they're now harmed and they don't completely understand. And when their only education is the abuse that they're experiencing, sometimes that's what makes them subject to increased numbers of abuse.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond to this question? Mary?
I liked the phrase, I think that it was Pam who said the confusion about good versus bad touch, right? And what those terms might mean to different people. And sometimes those words are useful because they're simple words, but then they need clearer definition. And some things we've been experimenting with, I really like the phrase of you're in charge of your own body, or the concept of bodily autonomy. And that therefore means that all touch requires consent. And there's an adorable YouTube video from Blue Seat Studios that's called Consent for Kids. And in it, it gives this example of a child being told to kiss Great Aunt Susie, who really isn't somebody the kid wants to kiss. Bodily autonomy allows you to say, I'd rather not, when you're 3 and you're being told to kiss Great Aunt Susie. And I love that for its power throughout the life course. And then the second piece of consented touch is that there is sometimes necessary touch. And I'm a doctor who has to draw blood from people, and none of us really want to have blood drawn, but and it doesn't feel good, so it's not good touch. And so thinking about how we proctor or support when there's necessary touch with someone else helping you know why it's okay. Let's talk, we could extrapolate that also to examinations of private parts of the body, or people who need help toileting that involves a part of their body that's a private part of their body. And so helping people understand between I give my consent or I don't, and then how do I deal with it when it's necessary despite my preference to not really do that. And so that's how I think about the structure, about understanding how much I own myself.
Thank you. I wanted to respond to this question as well, because this really is something that I think about so much in my own life. And I want to give a little bit of context that in the context that I grew up, I was never diagnosed with disabilities that I'm aware that I have now. I think like a lot of people who was raised female, I was really expected to take on the responsibility of my own needs and how I interacted with the world for myself, for the comfort of others, regardless of what that did for me. And that often left me incredibly confused about how people were operating, what was happening around me, how I could possibly fit in. And so I spent a lot of my childhood being like scared generally, but also not having any skills around how to determine who I should trust and who I should not trust. And to me, this is an incredibly important aspect of safety for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities, because I think many of us experience what is often referred to in literature about either people experiencing developmental trauma or literature about people with cognitive disabilities. It's referred to as indiscriminate attachment. So for me, what that means is I kind of generally trust everybody, and everybody is kind of my friend. That's how I approach life. And it even goes as far to be like, I can articulate why people see a difference between animals and people, or inanimate objects and animate objects. But to me, they're all just like beings that I'm interacting with. And I kind of trust my world, because it's hard for me to understand why people would be mean to each other or why people would hurt each other. And I am very aware that throughout my life, that perspective has resulted in me being taken advantage of in many different ways. And whenever I was still a minor, my parents, because they were in denial about disabilities and thought that I was just weird. You know, I was, as the oldest child, I would be frequently left at home to take care of my brothers who were 5 and 10 years younger. And I was told not to answer the door, but I never understood why. So I would always answer the door. And then I would later get in trouble, like, why did you answer the door to strangers? And I remember when I was about 17, right before I went to university, my dad one day said to me, because I got locked outside with somebody who had knocked on the door, and I whatever. So my parents came home, and my dad literally said to me, I don't know what to do with you anymore, child. Like, I'm gonna let you go to college, and you're going to answer the door to your rapist and let them in. And that is something that has just like been, it's such a difficult thing for me to have heard whenever I was young, in part because by that point I'd already experienced sexual violence, but also because that's been a repeating challenge for me as an autistic person, to understand how to determine who to trust and not. And I apologize, I'm being long-winded, but this is really important to me. So the second aspect of that is whenever I went to college, and I've been with my partner now for almost 13 years, and my partner is really the first person who in my entire life was willing to just answer questions I had about people around me, like why people did things. Why does everybody talk about the weather whenever we meet? Does everybody not know what the weather is outside as we're standing talking about it? Things like that nobody ever took the time to answer for me. And whenever we started living together, I would also frequently have situations where I would let somebody like in the house if I thought that they needed something. And my partner would get really upset and say, like, you know, you can't just let people in. What if they're here to rob us? What if they're casing our house and they're going to come hurt us? Like, you just can't know. And so for me personally, one of the things that I've used to try to learn how to be safer is I keep like a mental version of my partner in my head. So one time a couple of years ago, we were living in a place where there was a house where we're pretty sure people were dealing illegal substances. And one day, one of those people who lived there came over to our house and said, hey, our water just got shut off. You know, is there any way we can have some water from y'all? And I was thinking, I think regardless of what people are doing with their lives, they should have access to basic things. So yes, of course, you can have water from me. And I, in my service provider head, am telling them about Area 4 agencies and other places where they can get support for their utilities. And during this interaction, the person says, hey, would you like to come over and meet the other people at this house? And in my brain, I had to stop and think, okay, if I come home later and tell my partner that I went and hung out with the people who deal meth in our neighborhood, is he going to be upset for me? Is he going to be worried about what happened to me? And the answer was yes. So I thought, okay, I should not go over to the meth house. But I'm hoping that this is clear that, like, for me, that's not a normal process, and that has that similar kind of thinking of like having a really hard time understanding who is trustworthy and who is not, and how to determine your level of trust for people might be really difficult for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities. And I don't know how to teach other people about that, because part of what that means is I have to realize that my own assessment of people, of how I determine if people are trustworthy, is not accurate. And that's a really hard thing to teach myself, to not trust myself in this particular area. I don't know what the answer is to that, but I just think that's a really important perspective for people to be aware of whenever you're teaching people about interactions and stuff for safety purposes. Yes, Mary.
One of the ways that a group that I work with have been exploring related to this is actually using your support system as much as you do, but in a broader level for all folks, to think about what does it mean to be a fake friend? And that's a simple term we use. So someone who postures to be a friend, but really is faking it or lying. And how does one define the different levels of people in your life and what the rules of engagement of those different people are? When you first meet this is an example that a family developed for me when helping their child with autism. And when you first meet someone, they sit next to you in your classroom and you just met them today. They're not a person you should loan $20 to because you don't know if they'll pay you back. They're not a person that you should share your iPhone with because they might walk off with it. They're not like, they made these different, but having more conversation about it, develop this language. And I work with a group here in town, and they all together develop some language to support each other about these differences in a brand new friend, a kind of new friend, but then a really lifelong true blue friend who, you know, you could lay down and do anything for, you know, and I don't mean metaphorically, but, you know, I do mean metaphorically, you know, and I think that that is an incredibly important part of defining the possible people in your life. And we teach about strangers to 4-year-olds, but then how do we reteach about strangers to 20-year-olds with autism? And think about that at all those different levels.
Yeah. Does anybody else have a response to this before we move on? Matthias? Yeah.
Yeah. Also to add on, and there's it's never the survivor's fault. I'll reference it right now. It's never the survivor's fault. With that being said, we also got to consider the product of the environment that we live in too, especially for those who experience firsthand sexual violence and other forms of violence as well. So the message I like to give to family members and caregivers and even the self-advocates, the best way to prepare for people to address the risk for violence is actually practicing what you preach in creating healthy relationships. So for instance, how you approach people can help determine how the loved one should do it. Like for instance, if you know, don't let everybody in and explain to the person why you should not let everybody in whichever way possible, or why is a difference between interacting with a significant other and interacting with family members are different, and explaining to the person why there is a difference and how to not cross the line as much as you can. Then it'll be great. I think giving practical examples and showing people the ropes and being role models in general can help people with disabilities in general have a stronger awareness of what healthy sexuality and relationships could look like. And I would not say prevent it, but how to recognize the risk for violence and also where to go when and after that happens.
Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and go to question 3 for the sake of time. Okay, so this question is, how can consent in relationships be made clear and accessible for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities? And I'll just ask, since I know Cindy, you like the question to be asked first, would you like to start us off on this question?
So what was it again?
How can consent in relationships be made clear and accessible for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities?
And you said that was 3?
It's on page 30, it's on slide 35, but it's question 3.
Okay, 35. Okay, hold on. Sorry. These are kind of, oh boy. Yes, I'll do it. I'm just look. You said 30, it's question 35?
It's on slide 35.
Oh, slide 35. And what was it again?
How can consent and relationships be made clear
Okay,
and
here we go.
accessible?
Yes, okay, I got it. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused with, but it's fine. I'll get this. Okay, so my thing was you start when kids are little, from babies. Families need to teach it to everyone, even grandmas and grandpas. And then Pam's gonna talk too.
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, what we talked about, and Cindy made it really clear, is that oftentimes we teach the person with the disability about consent, but we aren't teaching the circle of people around that child, youth, adult even, about what consent means. And in this world of needing supports for various things in their lives, people with disabilities, there's an expectation that they just get to kind of come into their personal space and do whatever their job is to do. And they don't really think about or even talk about consent or asking for permission to enter that personal space. So I think in caregiving for sure, but I think also if we start it when they're young, like Cindy said, and we have siblings and grandparents and aunts and uncles and all of those people who surround your children, asking for permission, but not just asking, waiting for the answer and then respecting what the answer is and
Yeah.
allowing them to say no and not having grandma or grandpa have hurt feelings because of it. And that's a conversation I think parents need to do outside the earshot of the child to say, listen, this isn't about you. This is about teaching our loved one how to have better autonomy and be able to speak up for themselves when they're not feeling comfortable with that hug or whatever that is in their personal space.
To add to what Pam and Cindy is saying about consent, especially about asking, and the fact that I'm also an autistic person who's been through relationships and had a son as a result of one of them. Again, just like with my previous answer for question 2, practicality, practicing, practical ways of consent helps. And for me, my own tip and for tips for other people, whether you are a neurotypical person in relationship with someone with a disability, or even if you have a disability yourself, ask, always ask. If the person says yes, go ahead. Or if the person says yes, but do it this way, follow that direction. If the person responds other than yes, move away, disengage. I mean, it's easier said than done. I know it's a lot of gray areas, but at least the axe method helps a lot.
Thank you. Somebody else want to respond? Okay, I think one thing I wanted to add for this question. I'm sorry, thank you. What I wanted to add to this question is making the ideas around consent practical and actually having the opportunity to practice these things. One thing that I wanted to make clear is, like, for interpersonal interactions, like maybe it makes sense for people to know, oh, okay, well, that person, somebody with a cognitive or developmental disability maybe needs to practice saying, hello, how are you? And shaking hands, or choosing not to shake hands, or whatever the case may be. And those opportunities for practice of social interactions is much more common and easy than practicing desires and boundaries, especially in regards to sexuality. You know, sex is like a skill because you don't just magically know not only physically how to have sex, but what you actually want out of a sexual relationship or sexual interaction. And it's not common for people to think, oh, well, of course the person is really confused about how to communicate about their desires or boundaries because they've never had a chance to practice doing that with somebody. So making sure that education around consent is not just about consent, but is also practicing desires and boundaries and communicating about those with other folks. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and have us move forward to question 4.
Slide number 36, Cindy.
Okay, yes. Okay, now I'm getting this. Okay, thank you. So, it says, why is it important to define privacy values and public behavior? Because if you don't teach kids about public values, private, they may grow up to get in trouble because of the laws, or someone might touch them and they don't know if they don't know if wrong or abuse. So there's so many laws, so that's the reason why. And Pam will talk about it too. So why would I thought of this was because like you can't, I mean, people with disabilities also have to be taught when to touch somebody and when not. If they're underage and they touch somebody, they could get in serious trouble, you know, like go to jail or whatever. So was the reason why I thought I put this in here. We have to teach them when they should touch or when they shouldn't touch. And now Pam will take it over.
Thank you, Cindy.
You're
Yeah, Cindy and I talked a lot about whether or not if people don't understand the difference between private places and public places and private behaviors and public behaviors, then there can be this setting somebody up for failure or for some sort of behavior that now is seen as illegal or inappropriate or whatever that might be. But they also may not know that it's not okay to sit on a bus and have somebody sit next to you and reach over and touch you or grope you because it's on a bus, even if it is something that they may or may not want. You know, there's that kind of public component of it. So it's really understanding who can and can't touch, where they can and can't touch, and then the places in the community. And one of the things when I talk to individuals with cognitive and developmental disabilities, I really talk a lot about public and private restrooms because our community is confusing because we have what we call public restrooms in the mall, in restaurants. They even have a sign sometimes that say public restroom. But what we do in the bathroom is a private behavior. So that really is this confusing information. So really breaking that down and understanding some of those nuances that I think we assume that people understand, but we can't make those assumptions.
And if I could just add one other little thing, I just came up with this in my brain, is that I don't think law enforcement is very understanding to people with disabilities, especially if we haven't taught them about the boundaries. And of course, assumingly they're going to take them right, you know, to jail. And so we got to make sure that we have to make sure we're communicating to them what's right and wrong, so they don't land up in the system or get on the registry of sexual assault, which they didn't really know that was sexual assault. So And that's all I wanted to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary?
And there are many layers of nuance to this, aren't there? And so it's not as simple as using just simple language about it. You can't just say your bed and the bathroom are private places, because the mattress store is a bed, but not a private place. And a male restroom that has a row of common urinals is not the same kind of private space as a one-person stall is. And so helping to understand these layers of private and public are important in helping people be able to be respectful of it. The internet, which is public, has private things on it, and understanding the nuance between that. So I think that we have to give people opportunities to practice and understand those different layers.
To add on to the gray area of what is private and public, we also should know, we should not only be thinking about what's private and what's public physically, but also culturally as well. So for instance, especially when is appropriate to talk about religion, race, politics, etc. in a relationship or even among family or friends. Because if we cross those lines in any arena, then there's potential to be labeled as a bigot or racist. And if you mix it with crossing the line physically as well, then it's a recipe for jail or worse. So we got to, I think it's very important to add the cultural aspect, because that could, if we don't, it'll be a recipe for disaster, especially if you have a disability and you in a community that is if you're in a community with a different racial or social background, I should say.
You know, going off of what
sorry, Jordan, go ahead.
I was just going to add on a little bit to what Timothy has said, because I do think there's so many things that are important as far as cultural barriers go. And one of the biggest things for people who are neurodivergent is to use clear and plain language when you're discussing things. You know, I can think of a personal example where somebody told me they were on the down low, and that's a term that I didn't understand at the time. And it very easily could have led to me, you know, compromising their privacy. Whereas if they had just said, hey, you know, I don't want people to know my sexuality, that's, you know, something that is very easy to understand. And so I think that's, it's really important to include clear communication when you're talking about these things as well. And Cierra, I'll pass it over to you.
Cierra, I know we need to move forward, but I want to add one more thing that I think is really important on this, and that is that as somebody who experienced sexual harm from a very young age, and knowing that that experience is not uncommon for people with disabilities, that, you know, I experienced sexual interactions that I didn't want and didn't understand what was happening. And then because my parents were never aware of that, like it's still something I've never spoken with them about, they would have had no way to help guide me about, oh, that was not only harmful to you, but those behaviors are not appropriate in certain settings. And personally, like I've never caused sexual harm to somebody as a minor, but I very easily could have been. And the only thing that stopped me from enacting sexual behaviors out was a really deep fear of the religious implications, because I had this vague understanding that bodies were bad and I shouldn't touch anybody. But that was really the only thing that kept me from acting out and potentially causing harm to other people. And a lot of that could have, And I think that that's an important thing to think about whenever we're realizing that people with disabilities also may have had really early experiences in sexuality that they didn't want and that they don't understand. And that makes it even more important to be talking about public and private behaviors and recognizing that sometimes young people have already experienced things and that we need to be able to talk openly about those experiences. Okay, what's the next question, Cierra? Okay, so I know we only have about 10 minutes left. I want to spend another 5 minutes on questions and then we can wrap up. Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. How can people with intellectual disabilities be supported in communicating about boundaries and desires in various types of personal relationships, including dating relationships? Cindy, do you want to start us off again?
Sure. So we're on, let me see, what did you, how,
We're on
okay.
Slide. Yeah,
I
slide
got it,
37.
I'm good, yeah, I got it, sorry. I'm good, I'm learning this, but this is good for me. So it said, start when the kids are little from oh no, that's not the one. Am I on, oh, I'm on the wrong, sorry. Can you tell me which one it is again? Sorry, I just got mixed up.
Slide number 37, question number 5.
Oh, got you. Okay, now I'm getting it. Okay, yes. Okay. They need their own privacy. Guardians don't get to control relationship. People with disabilities get to have people sleep over when they want. Why can't people with disabilities do the same? So people without disabilities, they can come over anytime they want. If a person with disability wants somebody to come over, there's all these strings attached to it, just so you know. Now I'll let Pam take it over from there. I just wanted to sorry. I'm sorry.
I'll just be real quick and kind of just talk about, yeah, Cindy was talking about how many people that she knows with disabilities have all these rules around relationships, where they can and can't go, if they can and can't have a boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, intimate partner, and then whether or not they even can get intimate, and where there's privacy that they're allowed to have. So her statement is that people without disabilities get to make these choices and these decisions, but oftentimes people with cognitive or developmental disabilities, especially if there's a guardian or kind of a gatekeeper in their life, will
Yeah.
often put in these arbitrary rules that they really don't have the right to do, but they do it anyways. And because of some of the compliance that goes along with having a cognitive disability or developmental disability, and what's been kind of taught is to always follow the rules, they often don't find themselves with the opportunities then to do this or the confidence to say, you don't get to tell me. So understanding that. So I'll stop now.
Okay, let's have one more response, Mary.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. There was a question that I'm going to respond to within this that came to us, whereas a person was asking, as a caregiver, how am I bound by confidentiality and HIPAA to get other help for my person who needs help? And that becomes an interesting part of this, that support. And my understanding of HIPAA is that if a person gives me permission, if a person who holds capacity for themselves, meaning does not have full guardianship, gives me permission to interact with anyone, come with them to any event, talk to someone on their behalf, I'm allowed to do that because I have that permission. It's often reasonable as a health professional that I document that I was given that permission, because that helps me later if anybody says you weren't. But it is important not to feel trapped by confidentiality when we're invited by the person to help them. So that's one part of how to help. The second part is if you want to help by going to someone else and you don't have their permission. And I think we have to respect the autonomy of the person and comply with that. We might work to educate that person as to why getting other help would be very helpful right now. But I would still rely on the person's autonomy to give me permission to or not to do that. Hopefully that has answered the question.
Thank you so much. I know probably more of us want to respond, but I just want to make sure we're not going over time. Can we go ahead and go to the last question?
Okay, and I got it under control this time. So, first, they have to learn to let go of us. We're going to make mistakes. Teach us safety. Let us make choices and support us if we make mistakes. That's how we learn. And so if we're taught right as a person with an intellectual disability or a person without, we will make the right choices. But we have to be able to fall. I made plenty of mistakes and fell, and I'm still back up standing on my feet. So I have to be allowed to make mistakes. And so do my friends. So I just wanted to say that, and then Pam's going to take the last of this over. Thank you so much for letting me do the questions too.
Cindy, you did great. Go ahead, Skye.
Oh, Timotheus?
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. You sure you didn't want to go, Pam? I was just congratulating. But if I go ahead, then I'll go ahead and combine 5 and 6 together because I think it's important, especially on how can a person support sense of health and balance and dignity of risk versus their safety. As a person with autism who sometimes get blinded by somebody's attraction or somebody who shares similar interests, it seems interesting at first until they show their true colors, and then they become unlikable and sometimes harmful. It's great to have a friend who could help you navigate whether or not this person will be helpful or harmful in the long run. That does not mean, oh, you can't be with this person because I don't like them, or control who that person should go with. It's more so, okay, I'll give you information on what this person likes, what the persons do, what the person been through, or their past or whatever, if that's been disclosed. It is up to you to figure out if that person is the right, will be the appropriate person for you to interact with or not. But I am giving you that friend should give the person a open and honest communication on that interaction. And they don't have to say, do not go with this person or not. Just give us the information so we can figure out for ourselves.
Thank you. Okay, Cierra, I want to let you go ahead and take us out.
All righty. We have had quite a few questions, and what we tried to do is assign the questions to a speaker. So I think everybody got some sort of answer, and we don't have any time left. So I wanted to suggest that all of us answer the leftover questions and email you the answers when we email out all of the resources. Do the panelists think that's an okay idea? Would you be willing to give some brief answers later if we need it on paper?
Yes.
Yes, I think me and Pam, yes, I think yes.
Okay, wonderful. So just the last thing that I want to say is bring your attention to a great resource that the task force has created, and that is our online sexual violence and disability justice Patreon. And you do not have to sign up to pay. It's totally free. If you just go to our Patreon page and click follow, and then you can choose Facebook or Google. We have a lot of resources in here to talk about sexual wellness. And so I would just ask that you maybe download the slides and check them out. And that is all the time that we have for the rest of the day. At the end of the slide deck, you can reach the panelists by going through me, Skye, or Jordan. And we have just been so delighted with having you join us today. I want to say thank you so much to Skye for moderating that discussion, and to all of the panelists for joining us today. And if you have time, jump on the phone call with me so we can debrief. And everybody else, have a happy Friday. Enjoy your social distancing.
You're welcome.
Thank you all. Please stay safe.
I'll try to.
Thank you.